JavaScript comes with some really useful built-in methods, and those are also available within the Google Apps script. So let's create another function that's going to wrap the code, and then we'll run the function to check out all of these really cool functions that are built in. So we're able to use the date object, and what the date object does is that gathers the current date value from the server. So if we output that, that's going to return back a date value from the server of whatever the current date is. And this is all using JavaScript. So we're able to pick this up as a date object, and then we can manipulate that value. So if we want to get the number of milliseconds, we can use the getTime method and select and output that. So that's going to return back a huge number, and that's the number of milliseconds. So we can take the number of milliseconds and we can add to it. So if we want to do a value for a day, the milliseconds value is there's 1,000 milliseconds in a minute or a second. There's 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, and 24 hours in a day. So that's the value that we have for number of milliseconds per day. So we can take the current date and we can get a value for next week if we want by taking the today. And so we'll create a brand new date object, and then within the date object we'll take the value of today, get the time using the getTime method. And as you can see from the drop down, there's a lot of different date methods that come with JavaScript, and then we're going to add to it the value of day times 7, and then let's use the logger log and output the value from next week and see what happens. So let's run, and I'm going to get rid of that so we can see the value for today, and then we can also see the value for next week. So the value for today is the 2nd, the value for next week is the 9th. So that's how you can use the date object. And as you can see, when you do the drop down for the date object, there is just a ton of different methods, and these are all available within the editor. So there's the getTime, there's the UTC dates, there's the set time, milliseconds, hours. So there's all these different methods that you can use. You can also use the toString, so it's going to turn into a string method. So a number of options there. Another really useful one is the math method, and that's the MathRandom. So this is used quite a bit, and this allows you to generate random values and also to bring the values down to floor or ceiling, so around the values. So let's take a look at that. And if we have value of a, which is 0.5, and let's use the log, and then within the log we'll reference the math method, and in this case we'll do a math floor of whatever the value of a is, and logger log, and then do math ceiling. So ceiling rounds it up, floor rounds it down, so we should have different values for both of those outputs. So let's see what we've got. So we've got 0 and 1 for the outputs, and I comment out the logs from the previous part of this lesson. So that allows us to log and to round down and up. If we get a random number, so let's just get random number. To generate this with JavaScript, you can use the MathRandom method, and this is going to return back a random number, and this is going to be a value of between 0 inclusive and 1 exclusive. So that means that it will never be the value of 1, and it will be a value of 0, decimal, and a bunch of decimal placed digits. So let's output that into the output. So we get a huge number there. So we've got 0, decimal, and this is always going to be different. So every time we run it, we're going to get a different random number. So the idea is when you use the random that you multiply it by the number that you want. So let's say you want a number that is going to be between 0 and 9. So then we would take the MathRandom and we would take this number and we'd multiply it by 10. And a lot of times you'll do that within the same formula. So now when we have a random number and we multiply it by 10, this is going to return back an integer from anywhere from 0 to 9, and then the decimal and a bunch of digits after that. So what we can do is we can do a combination of the floor and the ceiling and round it down or round it up to get different numbers. So let's use the math floor and wrap the contents of the MathRandom. So what this is going to do is this is going to return back a random value 0 to 9 and output that, so just as a whole number, so that it gets rid of the decimal places. So that gives us a quick way to generate some random values, and then we can increase this value here to get the parameter that we want. And if we want a value from 1 to 10, then we can always add 1 to that. And now the value is going to be anywhere from 1 to 10. So let's run that, and returning back a value from 1 to 10. And you can see once we do that, if we create a loop around it, we're only going to get values from 1 to 10. It'll never be anything outside of that. So let's loop through, and we'll do it 100 times and increment I by 1, and then wrap it in the block of code, and then make sure that we wrap the log out. And usually we indent the code as well. And with the editor, if you want to select and indent the code on a Mac, you can press Control anywhere, and that allows you to format the document. And you can also have some other options here within the editor. And as well, if you select the content and if you press Control, you can format the selection. So what that will do is that will add the spacing and do the indentation. So if you select everything, Control, you can format the selection. So that's going to make the code more readable, essentially. And that's an option that's within the editor. And on a Windows machine, you can right-click anywhere, and you'll have the pop-up window. So let's run that output. And we see we're getting all the values from 1 to 10, and we don't get anything outside of that. And there's one more useful method that we are also going to be incorporating. And let's create an object, and using the object format, so that's the curly brackets. And we'll just do the same thing that we've done before. We're setting up an object, and we've got some parameters in this object. And let's say that we want to turn this into a string. So we can do the string format and use JSON stringify. This allows us to turn an object into a string. So that means that if we were to add to it, that would just be adding to the string. So if we do a log of the contents of my string, and when we run the code, we can see there's a distinct difference between the object. So this is still within the object format, and for the string format, it's actually outputting the object as a string. So it's converted the object exactly like a string. So exactly as we've constructed it, it's going to look the same way. So if we want to add an update to the object, we can't select. So for the object, we can select first, but for the string, we can't select first anymore, because it's not going to referencing that as an object. It's going to throw an error because it's not able to identify that value for first. So if we want to turn the string back into an object, and often you're not going to be doing it from string to object and then object back to string, but in some cases you will have content that's coming in that's a string, or if you want to store it into the local properties, which is the local storage bank, that's only going to require a string. So that means that you need to turn the object into a string, and then when you want to make it usable again, you need to turn it back into the object. And this is going to be called my object2, because now we're converting a string into an object. And the one thing to note here is that this is actually going to detach it from the original object. So in the last, we saw that the objects are referencing memory location, but in this case we're parsing the string into an object, so that's going to detach them from each other, and it's going to allow us to make updates to one which are not going to be reflected in the other. So let's take my object2 and first, and we'll update the value to John. and we'll output the contents of my object 2, and we can also output the contents of object, and then we can also output the contents of string, although that won't have changed. So let's save that and run the code and see what happens. So we've got the 2 objects here, and we see that only one has been updated because this was turned into a string, and then we took the value and we took the string value, turned it into an object, so that constructed a new object, so the changes are no longer reflected in the original object. This has been the last part of our JavaScript focused fundamentals part of this course. And if you are not familiar with some of the JavaScript that we've covered, I do suggest that you try the code out and get more familiar with it, as in the upcoming lessons we're going to be focused strictly on Google Apps Script, applying JavaScript in relation to being able to apply and utilize the code from the apps script. So we're going to be making use of all of these fundamentals, such as the variables, functions, loops, and also math and date objects that are already within JavaScript. If you have any questions or comments, I'm always happy to hear from you. So let's get on to the Google Apps Script part of the course.